With today's offering, we're charging ahead into Beethoven's late string quartets, which include some of this great composer's most sublime utterances, articulated from a condition of profound deafness. These final masterpieces were written during the composer's last 3 years of life following his Ninth Symphony. So, just as the Eroica Symphony lies between the quartets of Opus 18 and the so-called Razumovsky quartets of Opus 59, and thus accounts at least in part for the grandeur of the Razumovskys, so the great Ninth separates these last 5 quartets, or 6, depending on how you want to reckon the Grosse Fuge, from his other works in that genre. The voice is certainly much changed. The nature of that change of voice was captured beautifully by Martin Cooper, who wrote, "Beethoven's conception of sonata form moves away from the dramatic principle of contrast with its implicit idea of struggle. In its place, we find a unified vision where music borrows nothing from the theater, which had played so important a part in late 18th century musical aesthetics, and aspires to its own unique condition." I'm going to take a different approach with these quartets. Instead of starting with a glut of overarching information describing their overall shape and so forth, I'm going to dive right in with a movement-by-movement account, and we'll hope that that has its intended effect. We'll be listening to the Emerson Quartet's excellent performance, available on the Deutsche Grammophon label. Although the 12th string quartet, written in early 1825, is a long one, over 36 minutes in this performance, the opening movement occupies less than a fifth of that length, which means that the emphasis has shifted elsewhere. This shift of a multi-movement work's center of gravity away from movement 1, the standard ideal of the 18th century, to some other movement, was an ongoing project of this composer from the time his Eroica Symphony began to question that consensus. So it is that in the Ninth Symphony, as in the Fifth, the center of gravity is in the finale, and in this quartet, it's movement 2. The first movement is a sonata form movement in the home key with no exposition repeat. Does it have a slow introduction? Sort of, except that the movement's opening 6 measures don't behave at all like the slow introductions we've seen earlier, with one interesting exception that comes to my mind, not found in Beethoven, but in Haydn. If you'll listen to Joseph Haydn's 6th Symphony, composed 6 decades earlier, you'll hear something like it. That early symphony is a descriptive one and has a descriptive title, Morning. The first movement begins with a slow introduction, presumably representing a sunrise. That introduction is almost as short as the one in Beethoven's 12th string quartet, and might be said to represent Haydn's early, that is, immature, thinking as to the function of such an introduction. In Opus 127, it's almost as if, in his march to the musical future, Beethoven has reverted for a moment to the naive past, perhaps cast a backward glance. But that's not it either. Try to hear the opening 6 measures, which get as far as the subdominant chord, not as an introduction, but as the first theme's antecedent phrase, which is then resolved by what I have identified at the change of tempo as theme 1. That's a much more accurate description of its function as far as I can tell. That's why I've referred to those 6 measures not as a formal introduction, but as an opening flourish. By the way, the approach suggested by the analysis I just offered will be worked out to its logical conclusion in the quartet that followed later that year, Opus 130. That opening flourish will return at 2 key points in the movement. Once the tempo picks up, this lyrical movement unfolds in a more or less predictable way, with those returns of the opening flourish providing mileposts, the second one slightly deceptive, along the tonal journey. The second group is affecting in its sound since it's set in G minor, the movement's mediant key. A shift of mode begins the development in G major with the first of the opening flourishes returns. The second of those returns does not happen at the recap, however, as we might expect, but during the development, and serves to launch further explorations. The recap is artfully slipped into, the main theme lavishly elaborated, and the second group, now cast in E-flat major, is utterly transformed. The coda begins at the subdominant level, almost a nod to the opening flourish, and ends quietly. The second movement is the heart and soul of this quartet, certainly its center of gravity and virtually its purpose. The key is the subdominant, A flat major, and if one goes directly from movement 1 to movement 2 without these intervening remarks, it is possible to hear that progression as a resolution. The opening movement thus becomes a curtain raiser for the second. The second movement is even provided with its own curtain raiser, as the dominant seventh chord of a new key is slowly assembled. When the melody finally emerges in the first violin, it is a great, long-breathed, sweetly singing thing, gently ferried along by the fluid compound rhythms of 12/8 time. The theme is a gigantic double contrasting period finished off with some closing material. This theme turns out to be the basis of a set of variations, 6 in all, and I'm going to need to talk about them a little. The first variation, which retains the meter, key, and formal plan of the opening theme, is more overgrown than my backyard, a dense tangle of musical vines that conceals a few thorns and maybe even a scorpion or two. The commentaries I've read concerning this variation struggle mightily to invoke the profound, but I hear something different in it. I'm pretty sure its intent is at least partly parodic. Imagine this scenario. A composition teacher in a university school of music hands a talented student a theme and issues an assignment. Write a set of variations on this theme and bring it back tomorrow. The student returns the next day, not with a set of variations, but with a single variation into which he's dumped every idea that came into his head. In other words, while Beethoven's theme certainly proffers the possibility of searching out the sublime, that search is going to be postponed for a while the composer has a little fun at whose expense? Ludwig Spohr's? Nor does Beethoven reach for sublimity in his second variation, an absolutely hilarious tale told by a master raconteur. The commentators seem to be agreed on the playful nature of this variation, which is certainly beyond question, but is it an innocent children's game? The violinist's leapfrogging suggests that, but again, I'm inclined to read this another way. Think of a party that gets a little out of control, increasingly wild, even including a momentary drunken brandishing of fists. There's a little something extra, formally speaking, in that variation too. Watch my commentary for it. It's in the third variation that Beethoven reaches for the stars. The music shifts to the movement's flat submediant key, enharmonically-respelled as E major. The mood is one of religious ecstasy, very much like certain well-known operatic scenes, usually preceding the death of the love interest. The theme's contours are reduced to a few defining notes and woven together into something unearthly. Beethoven's opening up of musical space between the cello's deep-lying bedrock and the first violin's atmospheric soaring is a glimpse into music's future. And those of you who know and love Mahler's Third Symphony, written over 75 years later, will certainly hear a foreshadowing of that work's final movement in this variation's first consequent phrase. For the remainder of the movement, the original meter is restored, and the music returns to A-flat major for Variation 4, which pits the theme, now turned into a gondolier's lullaby, against arpeggiated and trilled ornaments, handed from bottom to top of the ensemble and back. The most striking and irregular stretch of music in this movement is Variation 5. The variation begins in D-flat major, the movement's subdominant key, but soon shifts into the parallel minor key, enharmonically-respelled. This variation is not granted a proper conclusion, but instead yields to the main key and a sixth variation in which the theme is spun out into a first violin tracery of 16th notes, its antecedent and consequent phrases given only once. A shift back to the movement's subdominant begins the coda, in which the music artfully shifts via common tone to a fleeting reminiscence of Variation 3, the sublime variation, before closing with a lavish benediction in A-flat major.
The spiky, jagged scherzo movement affords the greatest contrast in this quartet and also includes its one outburst of fury. The movement returns us to the tonic key, which is normative, and begins with the briefest of curtain raisers, just 4 plucked chords. The cello opens the first strain in apparent B-flat major, with a rising figure that sequences Mozart's credo motive upward in the Baroque-style dotted rhythms that also play a very different role in the next quartet's grosse fuge. The viola answers with an inversion of the cello's rising tune and returns the music to the tonic for its working out. That working out is a splendid example of sonata form contained within the bounds of scherzo form, and I believe my running commentary will make the particulars of that achievement clear. There is an odd stretch of music during the development, a snippet of alien DNA that briefly infects the work before being routed by the main theme. I'll be eager to hear what you think of that. Please offer your comments below. The scherzo submovement has a coda that serves also as a bridge to the trio. The music comes to a rhythmically hesitant close, the mode shifts, and the trio breaks in with a furious outburst of E-flat minor music, some of the fastest music you will ever encounter. It's worked out in such a way as to arrive in F major for a 2-part bridge passage that paves the way for the scherzo's return. Once it's run its course, a brief 2-part coda to the whole offers the briefest of summaries and makes its grand exit.
Movement 4 opens with a furious unison C minor outburst that quickly finds its way into E flat major for a gracious yodeling theme whose first four notes preserve the contour that opened the first movement's main theme. The overall outlines of this movement are mostly familiar, but some of the music is almost shockingly new. That skein of unison notes in the second group, for instance, that sounds kind of like a second Viennese tone row, and that axe grinding music that follows it. Another feature of the movement that's unorthodox is a complete return of the main theme in A-flat major late in the development section. I know of nothing else quite like this and am at a loss to explain it. Is it a nod to the second movement? Maybe. At any rate, the most remarkable thing about this movement is its coda. Here's what happens. After the recap has run its expected course, the music makes an unexpected detour into C major, and the meter changes to 6/8 time during a long trill. What follows is an essay based on the main theme, but radically transformed and modulating rapidly in search for the home key. I'm going to have to say something about that shift in meter. The basic meter of the movement has been alla breve time at a fairly broad tempo. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Be right with you in the scene. When the meter shifts, the 6/8 notes of 6/8 time are coming at about this pace. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, if you reckon those eighth notes as representing 6 beats to a measure, those beats are faster than the duple time beats that underpinned the rest of the movement. But you'd be wrong to reckon them that way, because contrary to what you may have been told, 6/8 time is not a species of sextuple time, but of duple time. And in that case, the beats are actually coming at a pace more like 1, 2, 1, 2. In other words, much slower than the movement's basic tempo. What's going on here? Why write a final coda that's slower than what preceded it? Isn't that exactly backwards? The only precedent I know for this coda is in Haydn's 98th Symphony, which Beethoven certainly knew well. The very same thing happens there. But in Haydn's coda, a furious outburst of triplet 16th notes soon provides the fastest notes by far in that movement. And that is what Beethoven has done. His triplet 16th notes are every bit as fast as the quarter notes in the third movement's furious E-flat minor trio. This 3-part coda is simultaneously one of the grandest things Beethoven ever wrote and one of the most puzzling. It leaves me with an impression that I often have when listening to Beethoven's late compositions, especially his 9th Symphony and Missa Solemnis, that Beethoven was reaching for something that he couldn't quite attain. Reminds me of, was it Browning? A man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? The work of a Beethoven is never done. That's why we need a Brahms to take up the thread, and a Mahler.
Thank you.